Hey guys, Dozer here, bringing you a new video. Today I wanted to have a freeform discussion about the new Ranger cards in Outsiders, do a bit of deck building, a bit of theory crafting with Lexi here, and see where it takes us, so let's get right into it. Right off the bat, Lexi's gotten a lot of really powerful tools in the new set Outsiders. She's not only able to use ice cards and lightning cards like from Tales of Aria, but now she also has these really powerful kind of vanilla Ranger cards as well to kind of pad out her deck lists. And so I've been testing a lot of different Lexi builds, and you kind of saw that in the gameplay video from last week. But today, instead of doing just some raw gameplay, I wanted to kind of talk about a lot of these cards that are on this list and really get a good sense as to what we're working with and what are the options and different ways that you can take Lexi. So for starters, whenever you play Ranger, the first thing you have to do is think about which bow you're using. Lexi has access to the most bows in the game right now. And so you've got things like, Barbed Castaway, which lets you put things from your hand into Arsenal and flip things to give them aim counters. You've got Death Dealer, which lets you draw a card if you use a arrow. You have Dreadbore, which lets you ignore defense reactions from hand, but also give a little bit of damage buff. You've got Redliner, which just is a 0 cost, put arrow into Arsenal, no other benefit. Sandscour Greatbow, which lets you get aim counters whenever you put stuff from your deck into Arsenal, but also you get to look at the top card of your deck by paying that 1 resource before you use a card from hand. So it can kind of be this other way to get card advantage like Death Dealer is. Shiver is Lexi's classic bow, which lets her give on-demand dominate by just paying 1 resource, or a +1. And of course, the most popular Lexi bow, Voltaire, is a really powerful bow, which lets you use it twice in a turn. As an instant, it can give arrows go again or +1. So fantastic weapon, right? Now, a lot of the time when you play Lexi, you really have to think about which bow you want to do from the beginning. And so sometimes you could run like a Death Dealer or like a Shiver, tall type of build. Death Dealer tends to be more popular for that, but Shiver also can do a pretty good job at that as well. But the aim counters don't really work so great with Lexi, right? She has a lot of access to cards that don't use aim counters, and her hero ability doesn't really help her use aim counters very well, right? She doesn't have that top deck access like Azalea does for the Sandscour Greatbow aim counters or the Crow's Nest, but she also doesn't have a lot of ways to reload, which you would need for Barbed Castaway. So when you're thinking about using aim counters with Lexi, normally it's not the most compelling thing compared to using raw value type arrows and having these really giant big blowout turns that Lexi's really known for. So we're going to start with Voltaire. Pretty stock standard there. From there, you normally want to think about which equipments you're using. The rest of the deck will be built around those, and so it's really important to know off the bat, which equipments are you thinking of using. So when you're thinking of a headpiece for equipment, right, you've got a lot of options still, right? Like you could run a Coronet Peak, right? You could pay that resource, make your opponent have to discard a card. That's a pretty powerful effect, but when we're playing Ranger, your headpiece is a really hotly contested spot. And so while there are these things like Crown of Providence and Crown of Dominion and Skullcap and all these things, we're really incentivized to use New Horizon, right? Lexi is the Ranger that can use New Horizon the best because her hero ability is what lets her flip cards face up in Arsenal. And since we know that New Horizon requires us to have a card flipped face up in Arsenal to get that extra Arsenal zone, Lexi is the best way to do that. Lexi can flip not only arrows, but non-attack actions or defense reactions, anything she wants. Whereas Riptide can really only flip those, arrow cards, but Azalea can only flip cards with Skullbone. So, if she ran Barbed Castaway, it'd be the same problem, where she would need to only flip arrows, and so you wouldn't be able to get those setups on like your other combos there, like with non-attack actions, things like that. And so we're going to be running New Horizon. Now, going off of that, there's a lot of debate about which chess piece you should use with Ranger. And so a lot of the time, what that's going to end up being for people is going to be things like Spring Tunic. Spring Tunic allows you to have a very flexible access to resources on your turns. And since we tend to run a lot of red cards in Ranger, it's normally very powerful to even use that 1 resource to leverage some powerful card interaction. Thing is that there are a lot of other options that Lexi can use. Things like Heart of Ice, which is an arcane barrier and kind of an Lake Frigid type of effect on your own turn, which you have to pay for, but it's pretty useful when the situation comes up, say against Kano, something like that, or even against D-reacts, right? Against defense reactions, it makes them a lot harder to play. But then you also have options like the new Trench of Sunken Treasure, the Ranger-specific chess piece that lets you put a face-down card from your arsenal on the bottom of your deck for a resource, and it also has AB and Blade Break. So, Trench of Sunken Treasure is looked at kind of unfavorably right now. A lot of people think this card's really bad, but I really don't see it as being bad. I think it doesn't make a lot of sense for Lexi because a lot of the time Lexi's going to be running Voltaire, and so giving up a whole card just for one resource off of Voltaire is not really that compelling, and especially because Lexi's arsenal doesn't really get clogged, right? Because she can flip things up with New Horizons, so Trench of Sunken Treasure doesn't have as much utility for her as it might for someone like a Riptide or an Azalea who can get their arsenal stuck pretty quickly and who can use something like Death Dealer, right, to turn that card in arsenal into a card in hand, which, is fine as far as value is concerned, especially if you run a lower to the ground, zero cost arrow type of list, where the idea would be like, oh, I have this arrow I don't want to use, maybe I play this arrow for my hand with the Death Dealer, draw a card off that resource, pump, 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 fire, right? Something like that. And so in this case, we really don't have that many options because a lot of these commons are not really things we want to build around. Things like Threadbare Tunic and Silken Gi, the Quelling equipment, these are not really things that we want to be building around since we don't really have any majestic chess pieces to build with. So right now we're going to stick with Tunic. Tunic is going to allow us to do a 3 of a kind off of just a 3 of a kind, so that's going to be very powerful because we're definitely going to be running 3 of a kind, right? The spoiler alert, right? So a lot of the time, Spring Tunic is going to give us the ability to shoot, an arrow from arsenal. It's going to be really powerful. So we're going to go with that. From there, the legs and arms for Ranger tend to be a bit more ad hoc, right? Like you can try and add a couple of different things. And so we can do things like bullseye bracers. We can do things like the various other glove pieces. Yeah, arms is what we want. Yeah, and so we can do things like Cracker Jacks, we can do things like Goliath Gauntlet, a lot of options here, Shock Charmers, right? But a lot of these are not really that compelling. The gloves for Ranger tend to just be bullseye bracers because it lets you load an arrow an extra time, and on an endless arrow turn or with a Bolton shot, that can give you some extra reach, which you wouldn't have otherwise. So this is a pretty good inclusion by default, but it doesn't block, which kind of sucks, right? So ideally, we would have some equipment that blocked. Shock Charmers has some Spell Void, right? It allows us to block arcane damage, but at the same time, it's really resource hungry and doesn't have a great, rate of return on those resources that we pay into it unless we're really committing to that game plan. And I'm not so sure that running a ice heavy, fuse heavy, sting them a bunch of times with Shock Charmers build is really the way to go. I think that a lot of the way that you get value off of Voltaire is by shooting a couple arrows on a turn and really using as few resources as possible to get those arrows off, while, with a 3 of a kind turn, you'd rather try and go wider with the bullseye bracers rather than trying to go kind of taller with those Shock Charmer hits. So there's also this new card, Vambrace of Determination, which is pretty interesting. It's really mainly useful against Oldhim because he has that damage reduction ability on Crown of Seeds. But the thing is that it's very specific and it doesn't really allow you to open up your own plays very much. And it costs you that extra resource, which we're going to be designing our deck around having very narrow pitch costs on everything. So, I don't think we'll really have the spare resources to use Vambrace. Now, I really like Toxic Tips in some Lexi builds, or in Ranger builds in general. Having the ability to pay one of those floating extra resources from like a blue you couldn't use all of in order to get an on-demand Inertia token, Frailty token, Blood Rot Pox. It's pretty powerful. It's pretty nice to have that consistency, and the one block really does matter quite a lot. So it is something you can consider running, but I think for now, we're just going to stick with the bullseye bracers for the aforementioned wide turns. And then as far as the legs, let's spell that correctly. We've got a lot of different feed equipment here that we can run. Perch Grapplers is definitely a very powerful Ranger leg piece because of its block value, right? We don't really use the go again portion so much, but it can be relevant at times. So it is a very good standard card to have access to in the sideboard potentially. But something like Snapdragon Scalers is still going to be really powerful. Even though it's a common equipment, this is one of the best equipments in the game because it just gives you that access to action points really, really easily. So we will be bringing those in the main deck and having a very standard Lexi equipment list because there's really nothing super compelling here to run otherwise. However, I will say that if you wanted to run a different type of Lexi list, the one that's taller, one that's more about disruption, you really can't go wrong with Mask of Malicious Manifestations. This card is really powerful because it guarantees you an arrow for just one resource and swapping a card from your hand, right? You're paying a resource to guaranteed transform a card in your hand into an or arsenal into an arrow card. So having this instead of New Horizon on those taller builds tends to work out because you're normally only arsenaling one card per turn anyway in those taller builds. And so getting rid of the one block that will destroy your arsenal or trying to set up all these really big plays, Mask Malicious Manifestations on a tall buff heavy build can be really, really good for adding that consistency. So definitely keep your eye out for that if you want to play more of an ice fuse heavy list about those dominates and about those big damage turns. Beyond that, I really wanted to talk about the main deck cards, specifically just the generic Ranger cards that I guess we'll look at the arrows specifically. Because Lexi really, and the quiver obviously, it doesn't super matter which one you pick. The Quiver of Wrestling Leaves is a good generic one. You know, it's always fine, but in my experience, it's pretty hit or miss. And while it can give you some wider three of a kind turns and will be what we are going to be using, it's not the best thing in the world. You can also consider running the Quiver of Abyssal Depths as a copy of Remembrance. That's just always in play. It's fine as a sideboard option. But so from beyond here, we need to think about our arrows, and arrows to leverage our Voltaire are going to be cards like Bolt and Shot. Bolt and Shot with Voltaire is an amazing card because it lets you attack for that one resource for 5 go again, which is already really good, but then also reloads. And so it kind of does everything we want it to do. It blocks 3. It's an amazing card, especially with Voltaire. It always is live for us, so we're very happy to run Bolt and Shot red at least. And a similar reason we're going to run Endless Arrows and Drill Shots, because these are 0-cost arrows that we can easily throw in at the end of a turn with a 1 resource or off of a reload, and Drill Shot helps us wear down our opponent's block values on their armor. It allows us to threaten Oldham's Rampart of the Ram's Head, and Endless Arrow is awesome for Lexi because she can easily give it that go again and really punish people for losing access to their blocks. And so comboing with our Bullseye Bracers and our Snapdragons can easily represent another 10 damage, because let's say we've got an Endless Arrow in Arsenal, we give it the go again off of Snapdragon Scalers, after a big wide turn, and then we can reload it with the Bullseye Bracers and fire it again for another 5 damage. So that's at least 9 damage, and we get the Endless Arrow back, right? That we can just keep abusing them over time with that extra little card advantage. And so those are some really great red arrows to start off with. And we'll return to Blizzard Bolt and Chilling Ice Vein later, because those are pretty decent arrows, but we're not jumping to add them into the deck list yet. So Heat Seeker is an amazing arrow for Lexi with New Horizon, because at the end of your turn, it puts a card face up from the top of your deck into your arsenal, and then you can choose whether or not to arsenal something after that. Heat Seeker is therefore really, really powerful, but specifically with New Horizon, because New Horizon gives you that double arsenal off of 1 card situation that can come up sometimes. So Heat Seeker is really great for that. Beyond that, we don't really love a lot of these other cards yet because they're just not doing a whole lot, right? So like Headshot is a 1/6 arrow, so you can shoot this for 1/7 at the end of your turn, but when we compare that to Heat Seeker, which is really only doing 1 less damage but getting a whole card out of it, I mean, you can't really even compare the two at that point. Heat Seeker is just a lot better. Beyond that, Hamstring Shot's actually not that bad. A lot of decks are pretty tight on the resources, actually. And so having a unconditional way to make your opponent's turn more expensive by 1 can actually be really strong, but we're not jumping to add that yet either. Instead, what we're going to think to do is look at some of the other cards that are similar to what we're already doing, right? So Pathing Helix is a card that lets you reload when it hits, and so Bolt and Shot and Pathing Helix are 2 sides of the same coin. They both help you extend your turns, not have to use your Voltaire as much, rather, you can shoot more arrows even when you've used all your Voltaire charges. And on your 3 of a kind turns especially, it can really help you extend. So we love running those cards. At the same time, we want to make sure that we are giving ourselves the ability to run the power cards that Rangers really have access to. So that's going to be stuff like 3 of a kind. 3 of a kind is one of the main reasons you run Lexi, because with access to Voltaire, you can dump a lot of the cards out of your hand a lot easier, especially if you're fusing. 3 of a kind can really help you extend those turns and get a lot of value. And so we're really going to be incentivized here to have that 3 of a kind, especially to combo with our Tunic. And of course, there's another Ranger card which everyone has on the mind that's going to be really good with Lexi, which is Frailty Codex. Codex of Frailty here is really, really powerful because not only does it let you, as the last card in your hand, play any attack action from your graveyard, assuming you have an arsenal space to hold it, it lets you get a Ponder token, and you don't really have to even do anything, and it gives your opponent a Frailty token. Needless to say, this card is really powerful, just pound for pound. But what's really nice about it is that it's also a yellow. It combos amazingly with Heatseeker, because let's say all you have in hand is a Codex of Frailty, and you have nothing in your arsenal, and you've got a Tunic resource. Well, you can just play that Codex, use your Tunic resource, come at your opponent for 5. If it hits, you have a double arsenal. If it doesn't hit, you still have an arsenal. So it's pretty good, right? It's pretty good. So as kind of a generic core to the deck, that's a lot of red cards. We've already got 18 red cards, and so these other codexes can be interesting, right? Like Codex of Inertia, especially for Lexi, is pretty low risk because any card that we get out of our deck with this should be, in theory, able to give us a lot of value. The only real problem is that if we get some like unplayable bricky stuff, Codex of Inertia can kind of clunk up our arsenal and isn't that amazing. That said, it is worth considering, so let's keep it on the back of our head there. As far as other cards, another power card that Lexi really likes to run is Rain Razors. Rain Razors is exactly the type of card you want to be running in Lexi. It lets you, play Rain Razors, hit that 3 of a kind, and just really go to town with a really big, wide turn of a ton of arrows and just really turn this from a buff 2 to like a buff 6, sometimes a buff 8. So that's pretty good value. We love doing that. In order to also take more advantage of that, we really like running a lot of these Bolt-in shots. Bolt-in shot, yellow especially, is really good because it just allows you to get that 1 for 4 go again as a yellow. Still really awesome, and it threatens that breakpoint to really help get those reloads off. And a lot of people like to run the blue Bolt-in shots. I don't love that card. It's fine on a Rain Razor's turn because it gets that 4 attack breakpoint, but outside of that, it's fine. It kind of lets you have a turn, but as a blue that only comes in for 3 go again, it's not really threatening that much. So a lot of the time I'm not jumping to add blue Bolt-in shot into my deck list before I look at other options. It's just a little less compelling than the red and the yellows. At the same time, trying to think if there are any other big inclusions we have not already looked at. A lot of people like to run Art of War, but let me talk about Art of War for a second, because this card is, I think, very hyped up. So Art of War, you pay 1 resource, like we Tunic resource, but you pay 1 resource, and you normally are going to give all your arrows +1, and you're normally going to banish a card from your hand and draw 2 cards. The problem is the card you're banishing is an attack action. So when we're playing Ranger, the biggest weakness that we have compared to other decks is that because we have bows, we have to draw our attack action cards. If we don't have any attack action cards, we can't attack. We don't have a weapon that can swing on its own. So we are really relying on consistently drawing our attacks. And so if we're using Art of War to banish our own attacks to draw 2 more cards, well, that's not amazing because we already spent a card to pitch to play this normally. And we also already had to get rid of an arrow. So unless we're drawing 2 arrows off of it, we're really not gaining anything. And on top of that, the +1 is just, it's half as impactful as the on hit from, or the +2 from Rain Razors on everything. So, and it costs 1. I mean, this card is fine. It's a flexible, powerful card, of course, but it just, to me, this card is not worth running in Lexi that much. It's just too clunky, it requires too much setup, and you probably can get by with some better cards, I would say. So that's just what I wanted to talk about Art of War for a second for. So if we start looking at, these kind of generic vanilla Ranger cards for Lexi, we already see that we've almost filled half the deck. In fact, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that we used a couple more cards here. We look through and we say, okay, maybe there's some other arrows, there's some other buffs, there's some other cards in here that we really like running. Maybe you want to run Seek and Destroy to help threaten your opponent's arsenal. Maybe you want to run something like a Sleep Dart or something like that in order to threaten your opponent with just a bit of extra damage. How could I forget Falcon Wing? So Falcon Wing is one of these new cards out of Outsiders, which has inherent Go Again as an arrow. And that's really important on a 0-cost arrow because a lot of the time Lexi wants to get these reload effects off, but when you have one card in your arsenal, reload doesn't work. And so being able to make sure you have nothing in your arsenal is really powerful for Lexi. In fact, that's one of the main reasons why Trench of Sunken Treasure is actually getting some experimentation from some people with Lexi. So Falcon Wing is a really great way for us to be able to say, hey, it's a 1-for-4 Go Again. That's fine. It's not amazing, but let's say we have this in our arsenal and we need to get it out so we can have a wide 3-of-a-kind turn. The reload is going to be really easy to accomplish thanks to Falcon Wing. And additionally, let's say we're on a 3-of-a-kind turn and we have Bolt and Shot, Pathing Helix, and Falcon Wing, and then maybe one other 0-cost arrow, right? Well, if we reload off of Bolt and Shot, we want to reload something that is going to keep our arsenal open for the Pathing Helix, because let's say they let through the first reload but not the second. It would really eliminate our damage ceiling because the Bolt and Shot would reload, let's say, Endless Arrow, the Pathing Helix would then be given Go Again, doesn't reload anything, we're shooting 3 arrows, right? But with Bolt and Shot reloading something that already has Go Again, we can save that second Voltaire for the Pathing Helix, which can then reload and get us a 4th arrow. So that's, a 33% increase in the number of arrows played. That's pretty powerful. So already we've hit half the deck with just vanilla Ranger cards. And from there, it's kind of hard to think about what else you might want to run from the generic Ranger pool. A lot of these cards, like, Poison the Tips, Rapid Fire, even some of these other colors of cards are not super compelling because they just really don't do a whole lot on their own. But normally, we want to be hitting a certain number of arrows in our deck because we want to be able to use our Voltaire twice every turn and have enough resources to pay for it. And so we're going to be really thinking about how many arrows do we have, how much resources do we have access to, and are we allowing ourselves to have the most powerful turns that we can theoretically have as consistently as possible. And so let's count up our arrows real quick. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 21 arrows in the main deck, which is getting close to the number that we want to have. Normally, you want to have 2 arrows per turn. That's normally going to be about 30 arrows in a deck on the expected end. Maybe you want to have, 15 blue cards or so because you want to shoot 1 0-cost arrow and then 1 1-cost arrow generally. And so being able to pay 2 resources for Voltaire and then 1 for the arrow that costs 1 is going to be where that blue comes from, that blue value. And so we're going to want to leave space for those as well as some other glue cards. Now we already have 3-of-a-kind Codex and Rain Razors, so we have some more room for maybe 3 more play sets of arrows at least. And that's on these aggressive colors here. We definitely want to run some yellow and blue arrows to help pad out our resource curve. And so one of the best things that Lexi can do compared to other Rangers, besides having access to Voltaire, is having access to ice cards. So ice cards are really powerful because they allow us to disrupt our opponent, sometimes without them being able to do anything about it. A big way that Lexi is beaten by other heroes is by blocking her breakpoint damage. Lexi doesn't really rely on a lot of attack buffs, and so your opponent is going to be able to pretty easily cover, say, your Bolt and Shot with a card like a Sink Below or a card plus armor. And so you're really always having to be very careful about how much damage you're presenting, how much damage you're able to force through, and all these things. So one really powerful card that I love using is Arctic Incarceration, red. This is a 0-cost ice action, which just outright creates 3 Frostbites under your opponent's control. Now, it doesn't have Go Again, which can be a bit awkward, but thanks to us having Voltaire and New Horizon, we have this really interesting line of play that we can take, where let's say we shoot 2 arrows on our turn and we are left with Arctic Incarceration in our hand. We could have given both of those arrows go again and end our turn with Arctic Incarceration in case our opponent did not block enough to, slow down on their own turn, right? And so if we're able to then drop Arctic Incarceration, we can really jam our opponent's plan on the math that they had been working out. On the other hand, let's say they did block out and they have no cards left. Well, we can just throw Arctic Incarceration into our arsenal and use it the next time. So it's really accessible. And it's not something I like to run 3 of. A lot of the time, it's really nice to be able to fuse with this card if you're running some ice fuse cards, and to be able to have it hang out for maybe a turn or 2 and not always use it. And since you can't use 2 at once, I like to run 2 of this card. It's a generically powerful card. You don't have to run fuses to make it worth it. It's kind of like just ripping a card out of your opponent's hand, except if they have all red cards, that's even better because you get to prevent them from doing anything a lot of the time. At the same time, you've got a lot of other ice cards, such as Icequake, which costs 1 and buffs things wide for the turn, which can be interesting if you're on this more 0-cost arrow build. But Icequake to me has always been kind of this awkward card because a lot of the time when you activate it, you just don't really get a lot of threat out of these frostbites. It incentivizes your opponent to block, and that's normally how they beat you because you run out of gas on a turn, and you're only doing a little bit of chip damage here and there, and they're able to wait for a turn where you're not that disruptive and then just kind of crack back and put you on the back foot. And so Icequake, for me, doesn't really seem to do a lot better than the raw damage or the raw value of a lot of these other cards. And so I tend to avoid this. Also, because it cares about when attacks hit, and you're normally only doing about 2 or 3 attacks on a turn, while that can be worth the extra resource, it just seems a bit too awkward to me, so I don't really like running this card generically. A lot of these other red ice cards are the same thing where, Weave Ice gives you access to dominate, but it only works on elemental attacks and ice attacks. It doesn't work on these vanilla ranger cards. And so Weave Ice, while a very nice, efficient buff that can give your opponent a frostbite, that can do all these things, it kind of is beaten out because we run so many of these vanilla ranger cards for Lexi's build that in these wider Voltaire builds, it's not as good. Now you can definitely get some value off this card in a more fuse heavy list or in a more tall fuse heavy list, but for our purposes, it's not gonna be great. Winter's Bite Red is a similar problem where this card's really powerful to be able to rip a card out of your opponent's hand with Go Again, but because they could just discard because we need blue pitch in our utility cards to be able to make things happen, we really want to be able to not rely on red Winter's Bite. And red Arctic Incarceration honestly works a lot better because, like, let's say we had a blue Winter's Bite and then we had a red Arctic Incarceration. Well, we can play the blue Winter's Bite, rip a card out of our opponent's hand. They don't know what we have, so they might pitch a resource, like a blue card, and they might have some floating, thinking, oh, we'll have this floating for the rest of the turn. But then we hit them with that red Arctic Incarceration, and so all those frostbites carry over the next turn. They don't have their blue card. They're much more impacted. Compared to if we had a blue and then a red Winter's Bite, that's always going to be 2 cards. One from the first one and then one from the second one, either discard or pitch. And so by being able to, and then we're wasting the Go Again, right, on the second Winter's Bite. So having those 2 in the deck as red doesn't make a ton of sense, but running them in blue can make a lot of sense. So let's go and grab our blue Winter's Bite. Because as far as blues go, it's pretty good. If we need to use it to just slow our opponent down, we can do that without them being able to stop us. We can flip it for frostbites for extra value, again, carrying over some of that resource denying value to another turn, kind of guaranteeing that we're messing them up pretty bad. And at the same time, we can think about a similar approach of the yellow Winter's Bite, because a lot of the time people have Tunic resource, and that will prevent us from getting full value out of our Winter's Bites. And so the yellow in this deck, we kind of like yellows for resources sometimes, so it's a consideration, but I think generally speaking, the other ice cards that we want to think about running are things like Polar Blast and Cold Snap. The main reason I like these ice cards specifically in a generic Lexi list is that, kind of in any Lexi list, right, is that they draw you cards when they're played from Arsenal. So normally their effects are pretty relevant. Dominate on Polar Blast, and this deck's not gonna be that powerful. Cold Snap can freeze up our opponent's arsenal or allies, such as a Dromai player. But what we really care about is flipping that ice card out of Arsenal and replacing it with something else if we have the free resources. And so the value we're getting off of that is, maybe we're turning a blue card into a yellow card by losing a resource, but we're drawing a card off of it. And so we are effectively, by playing this card out, giving our opponent 1 frostbite, which is -1 resources, and we give ourselves ideally 2 floating and still have the same number of cards in hand. So this card is effectively like an energy potion, which gives your opponent a frostbite, which is pretty decent in a lot of cases. So as far as having blue cards, those are some of my go-tos. I really like Insidious Chill as well for Lexi when you have enough fuses to make it worth it, because in those endgame scenarios, it can be really difficult to push through that damage, and forcing your opponent to lose cards before they even block can really help you push through that damage to end the game. The problem with Insidious Chill is that's really hard to get it out there. Lexi really needs to be on the front foot for most of the game, and so taking 2 whole cards, right, this costs 3 to play out an Insidious Chill, and then to have a whole hand to fuse with and attack with can be really difficult to pull off, especially in those late game scenarios where every point of health matters. Every card that you block with matters. So Insidious Chill for me could be really good in certain matchups, but as a generic main deck card, it doesn't block enough. It doesn't do enough on its own. At the same time, because we already have a couple ice cards, Channeling Frigid is a really great card. Anybody who's played against it knows that, but it blocks 3, it pitches blue. It's got go again, so you can do stuff after it. It really helps you slow your opponent down if you get the right turn lined up, or maybe you draw a full hand of blues, you can still kind of do something by, pitching one of those ice blues, slowing your opponent down, and still trying to maybe dig for cards with your quiver of Rustling Leaves. And so Channeling Frigid is definitely one of those great blue cards that Lexi has access to. At the same time, we don't really love running things like Blizzard because it doesn't block, and it doesn't, do a whole lot for us to slow our opponent down by only 2 resources, especially because a lot of the decks that we struggle into tend to be taller anyway. Things like Icelander, things like Oldhim, things like even Azalea, right? So we don't really need Blizzard a lot of the time. At the same time, something like Channel the Bleak Expanse could be really interesting if it didn't hard counter ourselves, right? So it prevents fusing, it prevents revealing, and it prevents searching decks for effects and drawing cards. We like to draw cards off 3 of a kind. We like to draw or get cards off of Heatseeker. We like to get a whole lot of good things going, like draw cards off Cold Snap and Polar Blast. So this card's not going to be great for us because we really do rely on those effects. And so even if this can slow down decks like Ninja or Ranger, things like that, it's going to hurt us too. So it's not a bad card, but I think we have better ways to disrupt our opponent than this card. This also could be a miss. They might not care about this effect on the turn that it's up, and then we do. So to me, that's too high variance. I don't like running that card. And then beyond that, we don't have a ton of other ice cards that are super worth running, but we already have a good number, right? We already have about 14 ice cards. And so that's normally going to be enough for us to get just solid value out of them, and then sometimes, right, get some fuses off if we end up running the Chilling Ice Veins and the Blizzard Bolts. All right, we're doing good on time here, so let's think a little bit more about some other powerful turns that Lexi is known to be able to have. So we already have a bunch of these vanilla Ranger cards to leverage Voltaire, but why don't we run lightning cards, right? Like, lightning cards must be good for Lexi. Well, some lightning cards are really good for Lexi. Things like Lightning Surge Red can be really powerful for Lexi because either, like let's say you pitch your blue card, right? You attack with a 0-cost arrow like a Bolt and Shot, then you attack with a 1-cost arrow like a Heatseeker, and then you have another card in your hand. Well, if that card is an arrow, you can't really play it, right? Maybe if the Bolt and Shot hit, you could, but Lightning Surge, you could just play out of your hand for free. And let's say it wasn't ideal to do it that turn, you could Arsenal your Lightning Surge, flip it face up to give your next attack go again. You could shoot an Endless Arrow out of Arsenal and then attack with Lightning Surge, freeing up your Arsenal for a big wide turn. So Lightning Surge can be really powerful for that reason. The only problem is that if you have this on a 3-of-a-kind turn, you feel really bad, right, in the hand, because it just kind of clogs you up and you can't really do much with it. However, using Codex of Frailty with this card can be pretty interesting at times because Codex of Frailty puts cards in your arsenal face down. And so like, let's say you had a, Endless Arrow face up in your arsenal from a previous turn, which happens quite a lot. And then you have your Lightning Surge in graveyard. Well, you can activate Codex of Frailty as your last play on the turn, put that Lightning Surge into your arsenal, not only fire it out of it right there for yourself, and then fire Endless Arrow, but you can give the Endless Arrow go again, and then fire the Lightning Surge, and then do other stuff. So especially on like a 3-of-a-kind turn or some other type of wider turn, you can play the Codex of Frailty first, discard an unnecessary card, and then draw 3 cards off the 3-of-a-kind, and then you can still have quite a very impactful turn. So I normally like having at least 1 Lightning Surge in the deck. This kind of rounds out our ratios as well with the Arctic Incarceration, where these are good cards to Arsenal and can also be really good ways to end our turn, but we don't want to have too many of these types of cards in our deck because they'll start to compete with each other in our hands and they'll get kind of clunky sometimes. So, and Codex of Frailty also kind of fits that bill, right? Codex of Frailty, we want it to be the last card that we play, and so if we have Codex of Frailty and Arctic Incarceration and Lightning Surge in our hand, we're going to be pretty sad about our turn. So being able to have as few of these as possible in the deck but still accessible is pretty nice. Some other really impactful cards for Lexi can be stuff like Lightning Press. When you use this on Endless Arrow, this normally represents an extra card of value in your hand, so that can be very powerful. It also helps you push through impactful on-hits, things like Heatseeker, again, gives you a card draw effectively. Bolt and Shot gives you the reload, and Drill Shot gives you the armor piercing. But the problem is that, again, on those 3-of-a-kind turns, it can be really detrimental to have this in your hand. And so we want to minimize the number of these cards in our hand that we cannot use for pitch on our 3-of-a-kind turns, because those are the main turns that we need everything to work for us to pop off. That's why we really like Rain Razors, because it's a pre-commit to the turn. And even Heatseeker, Pathing Helix, it's another red arrow, right? And Bolt and Shot allow us to threaten more of these cards out of our arsenal, things like the Codex of Frailties, things like the Rain Razors on those 3-of-a-kind turns, because those reloads unlock our ability to play the non-arrow cards, as well as more arrows, right? Depending on what our hand composition is. Another card that is really compelling for Lexi is Electrify, because Electrify, and especially the resource colors like blue, is just another way to draw cards. Now this card is surprisingly good with fuse lists because the damage that it does is given to the attack action that does it. So if you attack with a Blizzard Bolt and fuse it with an Electrify on the front end, if that Blizzard Bolt hits, it'll hit twice and will give 2 Frostbites. And, if that one doesn't do it, the next attack will get the buff. So Electrify can actually be a really powerful way to add more damage on these wide fusion turns, but we're not really in a hurry to add more fuses to the deck yet because we still only already have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 21 arrows in the deck. And these arrows, while we need to add a couple more, and still have a couple extra utility cards, are kind of good enough without Electrify, right? Electrify, we already have a bunch of these blue cards that are for utility, and so we really only want to have maybe 1 more 3 of these resource cards to play out our turns. And as far as blue cards are concerned, there are a couple arrows and things that we still have access to that could take up that blue slot that something like an Electrify could take. Now, we would really like is to have Amulet of Ice. So Amulet of Ice is currently banned because Icelander kind of made that card too good, but having a 0 cost, go again, ice blue, that lets us use it on our fusion turns to push through damage by forcing discards. This card's amazing. Unfortunately, we don't have it anymore because of collateral damage, so like a lot of other cards, Hypothermia would be another great one to end our turn with. It's kind of similar idea to Arctic Incarceration, but we don't have it, so we have to make do with what we do have. Let's see here. As far as lightning cards, there's really not much else we want to run. Lightning Surge Blue, Heaven's Claw, these are not really compelling cards for various reasons. And Weave Lightning is similar to Weave Ice in the fact that only buffs Elemental and Lightning cards, so it doesn't really work on any of the cards we already have. Beyond that, Lightning Press can be really powerful, but normally it's not going to give us that much value. A lot of our value comes from raw damage, and so we want to be giving more on-hits if we were to be doing something like that. And since we are running predominantly arrows, we don't really care about this generic buffing effect of buffing the 1-cost cards. We can buff arrows specifically and get access to some ranger cards instead. Now there are some generic cards we can think about using as well that are non-equipment, of course. Things like your Phantasm Breaking cards are going to be really important to have in the sideboard especially. Something like Down and Dirty comes to mind, especially for Lexi, because Down and Dirty is a new card out of Outsiders that allows us to block with it from Arsenal. And so let's say we're able to put our illusionist opponent on the back foot and we're punching them in the face. Well, they're not going to be attacking us back with any phantasms, and if we drew a down and dirty, we're going to be pretty sad. But because we can block from Arsenal with this, all we have to do is say, okay, well, we're going to hit you with some stuff, Arsenal down and dirty in our spare Arsenal slot, and then boom, we're able to keep that aggressive pressure. And so down and dirty is going to be a really great sideboard card option to have access to. Beyond that, though, a lot of these other cards are not super compelling for Lexi. A lot of the problem is that, again, we really want arrows to leverage on our 3 of a kind turns. We really want to be able to have just high value cards. And so things like Command and Conquer can be powerful, but they are going to be a liability more often than not. And so I don't really love running it, especially because we can only really do a 0-cost arrow into Command and Conquer and, you know, Erase Face, Amnesia, a lot of these types of cards. So not super thrilled about those red attacks. And since we already have, 24 red cards and we can fit a couple more into our deck, we want to start thinking about running cards that are more able to be pitched. Now, another interesting option is Premeditate. So Premeditate is a +3 to any attack played from Arsenal. And since we mostly shoot arrows, this is almost always going to work for us as is +3. And if any of our attack action cards hit that turn, we get a Ponder token, which helps us have a bigger arsenal, which we love as Lexi. So this card can be really powerful. I don't currently own a playset yet because the set just came out, and this card is like, I think $40 or $35 or something. So I'm not rushing to pick it up yet, but this could be a very powerful utility red card in our deck. But remember at the same time that we have to make sure that we are giving ourselves as many active attacking cards as possible. And since we already have 24 reds, our red slots are going to be really hotly contested. And so we're probably going to prefer some arrow cards over buff cards just because of that. The fact that we need to have access to doing damage. Snatch can be pretty interesting as a turn-ending card for a similar reason, where we do our arrows, we then drop a Snatch at the end after we've got our opponent to block out, and we get a bigger arsenal. That can be really powerful, but again, we don't want to have too many of them at a time, and so that could be a replacement to Lightning Surge. It could be a replacement to Arctic Incarceration, depending on the meta you're facing. But thanks to the fact that we have Ponder tokens and Heat Seeker, I'm not really, and even Endless Arrow, I'm not really worried about Snatch so much, because what we're going to want to do on a lot of our turns is end with an Endless Arrow, and then hopefully get it back and arsenal it and kind of maintain card advantage that way. So we're not really loving Snatch there. A lot of these other cards are not super relevant to us and our needs. They are just more of the same. These yellow cards, also like Art of War, it's not bad, but it doesn't block. We already have some 0 blocks and some low blocking cards. It'd be nicer to have some 3 blocks. As far as generic 3 blocks are concerned, what we really want to be looking for are things that augment our current game plan while not opening ourselves up to some new weaknesses. That's why Art of War is something I don't love, because we already don't block very well, and having cards that prevent us from blocking at all is going to open us up to Command and Conquers, losing our arsenal setup. It's going to open us up to a bunch of crippling on hits like Crippling Crush or Choke Slam or Spinal Crush, things like this. So it's really important to have a bit of that mix and concede the fact that we're not always going to get our maximum ceiling, and that we want to make sure that we are raising our floor as well as increasing our ceiling. And so a lot of these other generics, I think, Remembrance can be really nice in the sideboard, and these more fatigue-heavy matchups where we need to get our cards back. Quiver of the Abyssal Depths, right, lets us have one of these copies in play effectively. And slightly worse, but it's still good. And this way we can have a bit less of our deck clogged up by these Remembrances while still having access to some longevity in the game. Especially off of a 3 of kind turn, Quiver of Abyssal Depths can be really good at preemptively restocking your deck with arrows while you have those extra cards in hand, but you can't use them on anything else. So we have those. We don't really get a lot of benefit off of cards like Sigil of Solace, things that heal us. Defense reactions are also something that we can consider running, but that's not truly amazing. Tome of Findall is a powerful generic card that we don't necessarily love running either, because, well, we don't really have a good way to give it the go again or the extra action point, and we don't really want to run Mage Master Boots because there's not really enough compelling options, so not going to be running that. Now, a lot of blue cards can be pretty interesting because things like the items might seem pretty impactful, But the problem is that a lot of the item cards that are currently legal are not amazing. Now, Burdens of the Past can be interesting, but the problem is this new card out of Outsiders, right, that prevents your opponent from playing defense reactions with the same name as a card already in their graveyard. And if they have 10 or more defense reactions, you get to draw a card. It's a 0-cost 3-block blue with Go Again, which can be pretty good. The problem with this card is that, one, I actually don't know if Sync Below Red and Sync Below Yellow have the same name. Now we know that you can run 3 Sync Below Red and 3 Sync Below Yellow in your deck because they have different colors and different set code numbers. But when we search things like Belittle and Minnowism, right, that combo that was banned kind of recently, right, it didn't specify, you know, red Belittle or blue Belittle. You kind of just got to pick any card that said Belittle in the text box. So Burdens of the Past here, if they have 1 copy of Sync Below in their graveyard, then this definitely works if it's red and red, but does the red one stop the yellow one? I don't know. I don't think people are really running the yellow defense reacts right now, but to me, this card doesn't seem super playable at the current time. Things like your Clarity Potions to opt, not super relevant for Lexi. And again, they don't have Go Again, so we're already having a bunch of these cards that we want to be ending our turn with, and some of these are not going to be great choices. Now, Energy Potion's an interesting one. We love having Tunic Resource to have access to some more flexible hand compositions, and sometimes we can draw really red-heavy hands and have to take some really gross off turns. And since most of the time we're going to have some freedom to drop some cards, Energy Potion as a blue is not terrible. It's not amazing, but it is worth kind of thinking of in the back of our heads to be able to say, hey, maybe in the future this will pay for 2 arrows, or a whole arrow load off of Voltaire, right? It can give us a lot of flexibility in that way, and so it's worth considering. Some other cards that are nice and worth considering are things like Lunging Press. Lunging Press kind of does the same job as Lightning Press and getting our cards back, because most people will block efficiently and cover exactly the amount of damage required. And so Lunging Press can help you force through the Endless Arrow or that reload that you really want to get off. And as a blue, so you can use it and it blocks, so it's not terrible. And I quite like Lunging Press in a lot of the decks that I play, but it's also not super compelling. There's probably better options that we can find in order to really get more value out of our hands than just 1 damage and maybe an on hit. Especially because a lot of the times our on hits with Heat Seeker, it's going to be overblocked because if it's only coming in for 5. This is normally not going to be a card plus armor situation. It's normally going to be a card and card situation. And so normally we're not going to have that breakpoint, so that would not really help us there. And it doesn't help us on a 3-of-a-kind turns, of course. Now, another card that's kind of interesting is Potion of Luck. So Potion of Luck saw some experimentation with Kano and Viserai when it came out in Everfest, because especially when you would play Sonata Arcanix off of Bloodsheath Skeleton and draw, you know, like 20 billion cards, not that much of an exaggeration, by the way, for those who are unaware, Potion of Luck allowed you to take a bad hand and arsenal situation and kind of just shuffle it all back in the deck, retry, and go full up on, you know, resources again and try again. And so a lot of the time, Lexi actually gets things stuck in arsenal in an unoptimal way, like an Endless Arrow. Maybe she does a 3-of-a-kind turn and doesn't draw any arrows. And so Potion of Luck is just a Hope Merchant's Hood that works in your arsenal as well. And Hope Merchant's Hood lets you like mulligan and redraw your cards, but Potion of Luck as a emergency, you know, eject button can be pretty compelling and interesting in certain cases. So I wouldn't be shocked if one of these felt pretty good. In fact, I might start testing that because it just seems like a very useful thing to say, like, hey, at the end of my turn, I'm going to drop this. If in the future, if I ever have a hand that doesn't block well, have a hand that doesn't have enough arrows, enough resources, whatever the case, I can just retry. And that happens enough when you play Lexi to where I think this card as a blue, even though it blocks nothing, might be worth thinking about. So we're gonna keep that in the back of our mind. Something like this, Potion of Seeing, not super useful for us. We don't really care what's in our opponent's hand. Pursuit of Knowledge can be pretty interesting. So having 5 cards in hand as Lexi is often better than having 4 plus an arsenal, because having the 5 cards in hand allows us to load our Voltaire better with more resources, more arrows, getting those buffs, and not having a fusion arrow stuck in arsenal can't lead the way for other arrows to come after it. And so I also just love Pursuit of Knowledge, right? And so Pursuit of Knowledge as a 4-attack card for a breakpoint that can come in at the end of a turn can be really nice. Only problem is, again, doesn't have go again, doesn't work on 3 of a kind turns. You're seeing a similar pattern here. So something that's worth considering, but we don't love this card. And we want to only put in cards in our main 60 that we love, cards that really work together in gel. And so that's not really fitting that bill right now. Let's see here. We got a couple more blue generics. They're not super great, not super loving all of these. Time Step Potion doesn't really do anything for us. These item cards don't really do anything for us either. Neither does Talisman of Tides. And yeah, so a lot of these other cards are not super great for us, but we want to have one more blue, so we can look back to Ranger cards now, because we've looked at the ice cards, we've looked at the lightning cards, and we haven't looked at elemental, but there's not really that many cards in here that are super compelling for us. There are a lot of arrows, of course, which could be nice to fill in our deck with, because we do have some ice to work with, but a lot of these other cards are not amazing. Now, one of the cards that I really like as a blue is Frostlock. So Frostlock is a blue elemental arrow, which blocks 3, right? So that's already great. It pitches blue, it's great. And it's an ice fuse, and since we already have some ice cards in our deck, that kind of fits in very nicely. And what it does is when it comes in fused, your opponent has to pay 1 extra for everything they do while it's still your turn. So it's kind of like a Heart of Ice effect / Channel Lake Frigid, and makes D-React harder to use, which is relevant because this comes in for 4 damage when fused. And if it hits, your opponent cannot pitch or play cards with cost 0. A lot of cards cost 0, especially a lot of good cards. So this card is very good against aggro, it's very good against rangers, it's very good against a whole lot of heroes at just making their hands really difficult to use. Especially because if this hits first, they can't use those Sync Belows and those Vapor Scenes. Not only because they cost extra, because those are 0 cost and you can't play them. So Frostlock is a very, very, very powerful blue that synergizes with our ice cards that we already have, putting us up to our magic number of 15 blues, and we even get closer to our magic number of around 30 arrows. Right, we have about 24 arrows now. So now we can think exclusively about attacks and not feel too bad. Now, a lot of the time, we're not going to want too many more red cards than 24 to 30, because if you have 30 red cards in your deck, you're going to see some all red hands fairly often, and we don't really play well through those. And a lot of the red cards that are left in the game for us to even consider, things like in the Ranger suite, things like, Chilling Ice Vein could be useful, but the reds are just so debilitating, and we don't get a ton of benefit out of the red colors because, again, we are trying to go so wide and play so many cards. We don't really have that ability like Azalea does to just pay 1 resource and then draw off of Death Dealer and, get 1 yellow card to pay for our whole turn. We have to normally use a blue card to pay for our turn. So I would say that we're probably good on reds for now. We can look to yellows first before we fill out any extra red slots. And so when we look at Ranger cards that are yellow, one of the best cards that exists out there would be something like Deadeye, right? Because Deadeye blocks 3, it buffs our cards by 3. Even though we don't have aim counters, it's still a efficient type of card, but we need more arrows, right? We need more arrows first. And so we don't really want to rely on Fusion, because Fusion, while powerful, is conditional, and we don't always have a blue in hand to fuse with, right? We don't always have an ice card to fuse with. That might be our card for pitch that turn. And so we don't want to sequence in a weird way. And so a lot of the time we're going to want to make sure that we are using the arrows that are a bit more generically valuable. One of the first things that comes to mind for me is going to be something like Fatigue Shot, which we just passed. So Fatigue Shot is going to come in as a breakpoint yellow for 4 damage, which is very relevant, because if we end our turn with this, it comes in for 5, which is fine. And it can pitch for a couple things, right? We can pitch for 2 0-cost arrows. We can pitch in with a Tunic resource for some stuff. And so it's kind of nice to have there. But Fatigue Shot's really nice because if it hits your opponent, the first attack action card they play has half of its damage. This is amazing versus Guardian and Brute, and still pretty good against other classes like Ranger, because Ranger really likes being able to slow down their opponent's damage. And so Fatigue Shot, lopping 2 damage off of a forward power plus card, can be really powerful. At the same time, we have a lot of new arrows out of the Outsider set, which could be worth considering, like Withering Shot, Sedation Shot, or Infecting Shot. And we still have Codex of Inertia we can think about including as well, because this can help us dig into one of the cards we actually like in our deck instead of putting a card we don't like into our deck, right? So like, for instance, if Codex of Inertia is our last card in hand and we have a floating resource in that action point, we can guarantee an arsenal, and we can put a card into our arsenal, see if it's an arrow that we like. If it's a card we want to save, we can flip it face up with Lexi ability, and then double arsenal. It's not too bad. Also, we give our opponent an inertia token, which will prevent them from getting to arsenal, and so we can really be happy with Codex of Inertia for just digging deeper for more resources, as in cards, right, that we can use. But the problem with Codex of Inertia is that we don't know what we're going to get, unlike Frailty, which we do know exactly what we're going to get. We can plan around it. And while we do like almost any card in our deck, especially being able to flip ice cards or lightning cards for bonus effects off of Lexi, as our last card on the turn, maybe our Voltaire is empty, it's not necessarily the best play. That said, it's something that we can definitely consider because it does really work with a lot of the cards we already like to run. Now, some of the other yellow cards that we could consider running are things like Infecting Shot, because it gives you that breakpoint, the same as Fatigue Shot, but instead of preventing 2 damage on average, right, it'll give your opponent 2 damage, and that is really powerful. Basically being a 1/6 yellow as a way to end your turn, that can be really nice, but we already have a lot of cards competing for these slots. And so do we need any more damage on hit? I don't think so. I think that a lot of the power, right, of Lexi is that, or the problems that she runs into, like the bad matchups, are getting through those blocks. And so Infecting Shot doesn't really help us with that. And I'm not really loving it as an inclusion. At the same time, we could look to some other yellow cards, maybe like our Withering Shot, right? Withering Shot is especially good into ninjas because it can, in assassins, because it turns off their weapon damage because it reduces it by 1, making it 0, right? We don't have to worry about their ninja and like their Kadachis or their spider's bites anymore, which can be really nice. So Withering Shot's definitely a good utility arrow to have there, especially compared to a Sedation Shot, because Sedation Shot gives your opponent an inertia token. And since we're not really doing a ton of disruption, that's not super compelling. And so we're going to run into a similar situation for a lot of these cards where the yellows and blues are not super amazing. But what we could also think about doing is running some more blue arrows potentially. Yellow arrows in this deck don't do a ton for us because, again, they don't have amazing breakpoints and they don't really help pay for our whole turn. And so even having something like a blue Chilling Ice Vein or a blue Blizzard Bolt can help us say, hey, look, we have extra blues in our hand, we can lead off with this. If our opponent blocks it, we're happy, because normally they're going to block with 1 card anyway. And we can keep the buff going for the whole turn to be able to give our Frostbites to our other attacks, or our force discard to other attacks. And if we end our turn with this, which we don't want to be doing, we can give it that +1. So on second thought, that's not amazing. And I don't want to be taking too much longer because we're already at an hour, but we've already done a lot of work. So I do want to kind of get to the end of the day here on this kind of deck building little exercise. So I think what we are going to do is we're happy with 24 pitch cards in our deck. I'm not going to labor too much over having too many reds. Maybe we'll have to clip them down over time. But I think what we will do instead is say, we're going to focus on yellows. Main reason for this, by the way, is that Bolt and Shot, Path and Helix, these reload effects, if the first one hits, we'll have that 1 floating resource from the yellow pitch, and then we can use that for a 1-cost arrow. That's going to be really relevant for us, even though we only have one 1-cost arrow in the deck so far. Are there... Right, but if we had the other yellow cost arrows and doubled up on them, we'd want to have more of that. So if we're going to add some 1-cost arrows in here to help pad out our yellows in those off cases, something like Chilling Ice Vein can be really nice because we do have some of those fusion targets. But again, that's kind of inconsistent, whereas Fatigue Shot's always going to give you that value. Hamstring Shot's always going to make your opponent's first attack cost 1 more. So let's say you're attacking Oldham and you hit him and he's only got 1 card in hand, he can't swing that for his hammer. And the same goes for Azalea. Maybe she only has a resource enough to pay for her stuff exactly, and so being able to throw it off by 1 can be really nice. And it's basically a guaranteed single Frostbite, right? Infecting Shot's a guaranteed damage if it hits, right? And we're basically guaranteed damage. And then we want 3 blocks, of course. 3 blocks are really important. So Withering Shot can be really nice as a way to counter the decks that we don't like playing against, but at the same time, we already kind of do pretty well into Ninja and things like that. So, you know, maybe it's better to just do something like our hamstring shot for now, right? Gives us a bit of that consistent disruption where we don't have to rely on anything. Same thing goes for fatigue shot. Again, fatigue shot just allows us to heal effectively by hitting. So it's always going to give us some good value. And if they block 2 cards, we're happy because of that breakpoint, and we can end with it with a 5 power attack. And then beyond that, drill shot's not bad as a yellow, actually. Drill shot allows us to have more of those 0-cost arrow turns that we fire 2 things. And you can end with it with a 4 power to hit their armor. So you're kind of forced them to get rid of it. And that can certainly add up. And as far as other yellow cost 3 blocks, we don't really want a whole lot of these other cards. The traps and stuff can be really nice at times. Pathing Helix we don't want to have as a yellow necessarily because it's a 1-card block for our opponent. And we don't want, it doesn't have inherent go again and stuff, so it's not really great for us. We don't really want any of these other buff cards like Poison the Tips because if they block, we just aren't pushing damage and we need to push damage to do well. Searing Shot's kind of the same problem. All right. Well, to not belabor the point, let us go ahead and throw in our drill shots because, again, it just helps us push more of those armor points away from our opponent, can help us pay for our whole turn, and is unconditional value. And then beyond that, we can run our Codex of Inertia. Why not? Because, again, any card in our deck we're pretty happy to get here. It can help us set up more arsenal, it can help us slow our opponents down, and that's looking pretty good. That's looking pretty good. So what we're going to do here is we're going to cut the deck kind of building process here, and then we're going to be trying to play some games with this in the near future. So look out for those on the channel coming up. Thanks for sticking with me and joining me on this Ranger deck building exercise. We've got some more work to do on this, of course, but that'll come from experience and reps. And please feel free to try out the deck on your own. I'll leave the deck list in the comments, the description down below, so you can easily click on it and use it on Talishar or build it at home. So thanks for watching. Appreciate all of your time and attention. Have a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.